Welcome to the next Discipleship class. So, we'll be continuing on in our discussion of intelligent design. And obviously, we have to do a little bit different venue here, where the church is closed right now and we're unable to meet together. But I did want to continue on so that we will have classes. Right now, I plan on doing a class each week and putting it up so that you can continue on and walk through the apologetics information that we're talking about. So we are on the presentation for intelligent design, and in the intelligent design presentation, we had got about halfway through, and we're at the place where we're actually talking about DNA. DNA is just so complex. We had talked about that last time, and now I want to show you a couple of videos that really emphasize just the marvel and the complexity of DNA, because it's not something that could have arisen through a mindless process just by random chance. Far, far too complex. So these are the building blocks of all carbon-based life, and I think you'll enjoy these videos, and then we'll continue on.
If simple water molecules that form ice crystals exhibit magnificent structure, consider the design ingenuity behind large, complex molecules, such as DNA. DNA contains the blueprint for all life and is by far the densest information storage mechanism known in the universe. For example, the amount of information contained in a pinhead volume of DNA would fill a stack of books 500 times higher than from here to the moon. The program code and design of such an incredible system indicates a supremely intelligent designer.
The evidence to me that just cries out that there's a God is the study of DNA. DNA is a very powerful, massive information storage system. In fact, DNA that makes up our genes actually is like books of information that's read by a language system. It's absolutely phenomenal. And scientists know today that languages, a code, only come from an intelligence, and information only comes from information. Nobody's ever seen matter by itself give rise to a code. Nobody's ever seen matter by itself give rise to information. And as you look at DNA, it actually cries out, in the beginning, God created the universe.
We all begin as a single cell the size of a period at the end of a sentence. How does that cell know how to build a body with 100 trillion cells in it, thousands of different kinds, and each one of them is so complex, nanochemical machinery beyond our comprehension how it works, and encoded is the instruction manual. It's the manufacturer's manual how to build and operate every part of this incredible body made up of 100 trillion cells.
Furthermore, DNA is a three-dimensional molecule that is self-replicating. Each molecule is able to make an identical copy quickly and efficiently. The Lord has even programmed DNA to detect and correct replication errors. These sophisticated capabilities far exceed man's means.
God has created the DNA molecule in such a way that it is self-correcting. There are special proteins called enzymes that go up and down the DNA molecule looking for and making repairs on a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis. God created us with a DNA code that actually has what we call editase or editorial type enzymes. Just as an editor reads a newspaper or a book looking for mistakes, so God has created special enzymes that go up and down our DNA molecule, repairing the mistakes in ways that are unbelievably complex.
There are many examples in creation of things that demonstrate the biblical God. One would be in our very DNA. Our DNA has information in it. And there is a whole field of scientific study called information science, which studies how information originates, how it's transmitted, and so on. And one of the laws of information science says that information never originates by itself in matter, never spontaneously comes about. Anytime we trace the copying of information back to its source, it always comes back to a mind. And since we have creative information in DNA, that tells me that DNA comes from intelligence. It's not something that could possibly come about through millions of years of mutations and natural selection. That just won't work.
Yet even the DNA molecule is simple compared to cells. All life consists of cells, and each cell functions as a miniature city. When we consider that a human body consists of trillions of cells working together as one unit, we should be in humble awe of our Creator's intimate care and perfect wisdom.
So that was pretty interesting, obviously. And for those of you who might have missed science class in high school, it's just a little bit of a refresher. Anyways, this next video is going to actually go into some depth on the kinesin, which is inside the cell. Again, just really, really fascinating stuff. So I think you'll really enjoy it.
Cells are full of specialized components that perform functions vital to their existence. But how do these components get to the right locations inside the cell to perform their functions? For larger components, a transportation system is needed. Meet the kinesin. Masterpieces of microengineering, kinesins are miniature motorized machines that carry cargo from one part of the cell to another, walking along self-assembling highways called microtubules. Known as the workhorses of the cell, kinesins have 2 feet, or globular heads, that literally walk 1 foot over another along the microtubule, pulling their cargo to its destination. Each foot possesses 2 special locations called binding sites that interact with other molecules. One site attaches to the microtubule and the other binds with ATP, the energy molecule of the cell. When one foot binds with ATP and uses its energy, the foot flips over, resulting in the walking motion. Each foot has a short neck which is connected to a strand of a long coiled stalk. At the end of the stalk is a fan-shaped tail which holds tightly to the cargo being transported. Kinesins can carry cargo that are many times their own size. Sometimes a kinesin is in danger of getting stuck on the microtubule highway because of blockages caused by other cellular components. To get around such obstacles, multiple motor proteins may be used to carry a single piece of cargo, together providing enough force to break free. Kinesins typically walk away from the center of the cell and toward the cell's periphery. The kinesin's 2 feet work together efficiently, with one foot holding fast to the microtubule, while the other releases itself and takes a step forward. This coordinated stepwise movement allows kinesin motors to walk as many as 100 steps per second, moving about 8 nanometers with each step. When not carrying cargo, kinesins can shift to energy-saving mode to conserve fuel until their next job. The kinesin plays a vital role in many cellular processes, not just transporting materials, but also aiding cell replication. The walking kinesin molecular machine, another example of intelligent design.
I love watching that. Those things are just so cool. And think about it. I mean, you're talking about all this work going on inside the cell, and we're going to see even some more information on that, which again is just, I honestly don't know how once we discovered DNA and then have the capability of looking inside the cell now that anybody can ever imagine that mindless evolutionary process is even on the table. But people do.
Sometimes I run into this question or this argument against the teleological argument, which would be the puddle argument.
Yeah.
Which claims that the teleological argument, even though it has specifications that ultimately lead up to human life, it seems that through the puddle argument, it's more like it's just an appeal to pathos than it really is to any logic.
Explain what you mean by the puddle argument.
It's like saying, oh, I'm just here. I have every specification to be here. Therefore, I must have like a special reason to be here, and I must have a special cause to be here. And it's not really anything more than that.
Well, I think if I understand the puddle argument, they're saying that the reason there's a puddle there is there's a hole in the ground and it's filled with water, and that's just the way it is, and we're kind of the same way. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, practically.
It's kind of like what we're doing is we see a target, we see an arrow in the wall, and we go up and draw a bullseye around it.
Yeah.
Okay? Well, I don't think that works for a number of reasons. One reason, obviously, is the universe had a beginning, and secondly, a fine-tuned beginning. And you can't make any puddle argument for that, because nothing exists until the universe exists, nothing made of molecules anyway, and it's precisely fine-tuned. If it were changed any way, slightly, any one of those factors, slightly, nothing would exist or nothing livable would exist. Okay, so there appears to be intelligence behind the universe. Secondly, the genome that we mentioned earlier, the 3.2 billion letter genome, is like a software program. If you're walking along the beach and you see in the sand, John loves Mary, you don't go, gee, the waves made that. Or the crabs came out of the water and made that message in the sand, right? You know immediately that that message must be the product of a mind. In all our prior experience, messages always come from minds. Now that's just a few letters long or a couple of words long. But imagine a message 3.2 billion letters long in every one of our cells. If John loves Mary requires a message, a messenger, a mind, then a software program 3.2 billion letters long also seems to require a mind, a great mind, to create. And look, atheists can get rid of the argument from information in DNA by simply answering this question: what natural laws can create messages? There's only 4 known natural forces: gravity, the strong and weak nuclear forces, and electromagnetism, light. Which one of those 4, or combination thereof, can create a software program? The answer is none of them. And if they're going to say, well, one day we'll figure that out, I call that faith. That's called natural law of the gaps.
So again, Frank comes through with a good answer. So we'll continue on to the next slide. So this is now what we call irreducible complexity. This was first presented by Michael Behe in I think 1994, and he wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, which we'll get into in a moment. But this idea of irreducible complexity is that you can only take things apart so far, and then they don't work anymore. And if that's the case, then they can't build the other way. You can't construct something that has a purpose and a design to it, and then just say, well, it kind of developed in that way, especially when it doesn't meet any of its intended purpose along the way. In other words, you can only reduce things so far because of their complexity, to the point where, like with this mousetrap, what can you take away from it and it's still going to work? So even the mousetrap, though it's simple, it's only got a few components that make it work, it still requires a designer, which is purposeful forethought, that's required to be put into it. It doesn't just make itself. and it wouldn't just get there by accident. So all the parts need to work. It's an entire system. That's the key. So your car is irreducibly complex. You can take some pieces off of it, but you will get down to the place where at some point it won't work anymore. As a matter of fact, all you have to do is take one wheel off. It's not going to go anywhere. So there's only so many components that you can remove from an automobile and have it still function in that way. So
Michael Behe has devoted his career to the study of the design and operation of the cell. He has also written extensively on the biochemical challenge to evolution.
Most people have no idea of how small and complex cells are. A typical cell from you or me, called a eukaryotic cell, is probably 1/10 of the size of the head of a pin. And yet in that single cell, there are about 3 billion units of DNA making out the chromosomes. And those 3 billion units make the molecular machines of the cell, literally machines that make the cell work.
With computer animation, we can enter the cell. Here, the staggering complexity of its molecular machinery is clearly seen.
It's like going into an automobile factory. The factory has a large number of machines. The parts have to fit together in very specific ways to do their jobs, and if things go wrong, the cell is in big trouble. And just one cell is enormously complex, but humans, you and I, are made from trillions of cells, and those trillions of cells have to fit together in the right way and do their own job. Darwinism was a lot more plausible when we were thinking about globs of protoplasm than it is when we're thinking about molecular machines.
Each of these biochemical machines is a masterpiece of engineering and nanotechnology. They are essential to functions as vital and diverse as vision, photosynthesis, and the production of energy in the cell. Michael Behe has studied several of these machines, including the flagellum, a remarkable rotary motor.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called a bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor. And I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed. That's no chance assemblage of parts.
So you can see that though we're kind of driving this point home, Behe is really kind of on the forefront of presenting, especially the bacterial flagellum, for irreducible complexity. And we'll see how they discuss, obviously, some of the complexity of it. And they can certainly talk about it better than me, so we'll move on with that.
In Darwin's Black Box in 1996, Behe spotlighted and made famous a number of really interesting discoveries that had been occurring in biochemistry and cell biology over the last 2 or 3 decades. And what biologists, molecular biologists, cell biologists, microbiologists have been discovering is that at the level of individual cells, there are little tiny examples of nanotechnology, little tiny machines at work. The flagellar motor is the one that Behe made most famous. It's a rotary engine that powers a whip-like tail, a protein tail that functions like a propeller, and it moves the bacterium through liquid, enabling the bacterium to essentially track down its food supply. And this little machine includes a rotor, a stator, a drive shaft, a U-joint, bushings, bearings, and a whip-like tail that functions like a propeller. And the machine in some bacterial systems turns at 100,000 RPMs in one direction and can reverse direction on a quarter of a turn and turn 100,000 RPM in the other direction.
Bacterial flagellum is a true nanomachine, about 40 nanometers in size. It's amazing. I mean, E. coli, Salmonella, which are kind of our model systems for the bacterial flagellum, can propel a cell about 20 lengths per second through a very viscous medium, like water to these organisms. And you extrapolate that to human scale, 20 body lengths per second, 6 foot person, times 20, 120 feet per second. Mark Spitz or Phelps would be setting records with this type of propulsion.
It's hardwired into a signal transduction circuit that allows the bacterium to sense changes in the sugar gradient in the surrounding liquid.
This signal transduction system is actually a short-term memory system where the cell is, if it's going in the direction of an attractant, a nutrient that it can use to metabolize, it follows that chemical gradient. If it's a repellent, it will sense that and move in the opposite direction. So it's more than just this engine.
It's an extraordinary piece of nanotechnology. It's high tech in low life. And so just by spotlighting these extraordinary pieces of nanotechnology inside cells, and the flagellar motor wasn't the only one by any means, Behe, in a sense, opened up a window for people. He opened up the black box of the inner workings of the cell and said, look, this is much more complex than anything that the early evolutionary biologists had envisioned. Darwin knew nothing of this type of nanotechnology in cells, and at the very least, we've got to come up with an explanation for this.
So, obviously, within the scientific experts that really understand this, they can point some of it out. But for our purposes, we're looking at it the way Behe originally introduced it, as something that's something that exists that is irreducibly complex. You can't take pieces away from that bacterial flagellum and then have it work. It's just, and it won't build piece by piece to get to that place. So this is the book Darwin's Black Box that Behe wrote back in '96, and it really did help and was at the forefront of launching the intelligent design movement. So really, it's an interesting book. I mean, there's a number of books by different authors that have come out since then that get into some of the detail on this if you're actually interested in this kind of reading. So he says in the book, no one at Harvard University, no one at the National Institutes of Health, no member of the National Academy of Sciences, no Nobel Prize winner, no one at all can give a detailed account of how the cilium or vision or blood clotting or any complex biochemical process might have developed in a Darwinian fashion. Other examples abound, including aspects of DNA replication, electron transport, telomere synthesis, photosynthesis, transcription regulation, and more. So we look at the eye, for example, and we say, look at what can you remove from your eye and have it still work? It's not going to work. The eye is irreducibly complex. Can't take any pieces away. It just won't function. So Behe goes on to say, the conclusion of intelligent design flows naturally from the data itself, not from sacred books or sectarian beliefs. Inferring that biochemical systems were designed by an intelligent agent is a humdrum process that requires no new principles of logic or science. Life on Earth, at its most fundamental level, in its most critical components, is the product of intelligent activity. So the problem is that evolutionists, atheists, they reject a designer, and therefore they reject design. So, Francis Crick, he was co-discoverer of the DNA molecule. He said biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why would they have to do that? I mean, are they supposed to just listen to what Crick said and ignore what they're looking at? I mean, that's absurd. That's not science. That's indoctrination. Richard Dawkins said, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Probably not the best thing to say on page 1 of a book that you're writing that's going to try to dismantle the concept of design, but he did that nonetheless in The Blind Watchmaker. He also said in River Out of Eden, A Darwinian View of Life, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Talk about depressing fatalism. But the last quote could possibly be said of Dawkins' books. No design, no purpose, nothing but pitiless indifference. Why should we read his books? I mean, if nothing is designed, then that means his book isn't designed. Remember, you go back to the exercise on the law of non-contradiction, and if nothing is designed and nothing can be designed, then what is he doing? He's designing a book for you to read it so that you can follow what he thinks is his logical conclusion, which in his world, logic actually doesn't exist. So there's two central arguments for evolution. Now, this is not something typically that you would get into with an atheist necessarily. I'm adding it in here because it's a component that will be helpful for you as a Christian. But as far as trying to just deal with the design argument, if you need this, you can use it. But the key is that all carbon-based life, as well as the universe itself, provides evidence of design. So the first argument is small adaptations lead to new species. They would call that micro to macro evolution. And again, micro evolution is modification within a species. Macro evolution is one species to another. The second is similarities in structure. We call that homology, right? And DNA are evidences of a common ancestor. So these are the two central arguments for evolution that they would put forward. And we'll look at the first one first, right? Small adaptations or micro to macro evolution. So change attributed to natural selection is cyclical, not directional. In other words, they go through cycles. That's what Darwin found, actually, on the Galapagos Islands with his finches, that the beak size changed depending upon the season. Essentially, the larger beaked finches were able to survive when it was required that they had to crack larger nuts to get food. So that's not directional to another species. That is a modification within the finches themselves. They weren't changing into something else, right? So you start with finches, you end with finches, but the origin of finches is never explained. So in Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, he was talking about survival, not arrival of the species. Altogether different. So where did finches come from? Darwin had a view on survival, but not arrival of the species in his origins, right? Modifications within a species is not evolution. That is not a definition or an example of evolution. So that's the first one. Second one, which is similarities in structure, we call that homology. We see this in DNA, and there's evidence of what they see as a common ancestor. We would see it differently. Again, Richard Dawkins, writing to Philip Johnson, said, the reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. This is what Dawkins and other evolutionists feel that is what defines for them the reason that there's this similarity within the DNA code. In other words, everybody has DNA, that is alive. So, but what about similarity, right? DNA similarity is about 96% between apes and humans, but also 90% between mice and humans. Because of the complex ways cells use genetic information, very small genetic differences can produce big functional changes. So DNA similarity could be evidence of a common designer rather than a common ancestor. Similar structures often have a similar blueprint. So these obviously, I mean, if God was going to make, and again, we're not talking the God of the Bible at this point or whatever, but we haven't got there yet, but if the designer, if the creator of the universe and the designer of all life decides to use the same DNA as the structure for life, why would he change it from one thing into another thing? I mean, DNA works fine. I mean, we saw some of the complexity of it. There's no reason to change it. So to make the assumption without evidence that the similarity means one thing changed into another is a huge jump, because it's an assumption which they try to prove because there's no evidence to support it. What about DNA similarity? Darwinists must explain the vast dissimilarity between living things: the bee, octopus, Venus flytrap, mildew, peacock, porcupine, and human. The burden of proof is really on them. Why such vast differences, though similar in the foundational design of carbon-based life? So again, we have Richard Dawkins saying the reason we know for certain, and again, talk about trying to prove an assumption, we're all related, including bacteria is the universality genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. My philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true, but I would prefer to characterize it as philosophical commitment to real explanation as opposed to complete lack of explanation, which is what you espouse. This is the continuation on in his letter. But he rules out intelligence beforehand, so he begs the question, or basically he's assuming what he's trying to prove. He just assumes that materialism is true and then just sees everything in light of that truth without evidence. So we saw Stephen Meyer in one of the previous videos a few minutes ago. He wrote a book called Signature in the Cell, which is about DNA and the detail in the cell. If you're interested, again, in that kind of reading, he's one of the leaders in the Intelligent Design Group and Discovery Institute, so that's a great book if you want to get on that road. Einstein on science and philosophy. The man of science is a poor philosopher. And isn't that the truth? Because as we're going through and we're defining philosophy as the ability to reason through and make logical deductions and all that, sometimes they can be poor philosophers, because we see some very intelligent atheists with extremely poor reasoning skills, which is, again, their commitment to materialism causes them to not think clearly. Follow the evidence where it leads. That's what Anthony Flew said, and it led him from being an atheist to at least an agnostic. Homology, right? Does similarity of structure prove a common ancestor? Well, no, of course not. As we're talking about, there's a lot of like in the picture here, you got a dog, a bat, a seal, a man. Everybody has limbs. That doesn't mean that one came from the other. The same thing down below, you see the shark, salamander, chicken, chimpanzee, and man. Just because they all have to develop within the womb does not mean that they're all changing from one to the other. Those similarities do not prove evolution. Does similarity of structure prove that the pot evolved from the teaspoon? No, obviously not, but again, from a materialistic perspective, the way these Darwinian evolutionists reason, then you would have to conclude that. Darwinist Tim Barra offered the progression of the Corvette as evidence of descent with modification. In other words, he thought that moving through the development of the Corvette showed kind of bolstered the argument from evolution. However, it's now known as Barra's blunder because this is an illustration of intelligent design. People with intelligence improved the Corvette's design over the year. It didn't do it on its own, which is why they termed it Barra's blunder. So Darwinists say that we know all of Earth's creatures share a common ancestor by way of unguided macro, one change to another species, evolutionary process because of DNA and homology. And how do we know that DNA and homology all point to a common ancestor rather than a common designer? Because macro evolution is true. That's what they would say. But that's circular reasoning. In other words, well, I know macro evolution is true, so that's why I know that they're all related and change one to the other. So does science say anything? No, just scientists do. Science doesn't say anything. Science gives you data and information, but the scientists have to come to the conclusion based on how they understand the data and what their evidence is. So how does their thinking work? This is what we start with. How do you know evolution is true? They reason DNA homology. Well, and then they reason that there's a common ancestor because of that. Why not a common designer? Well, because evolution is true. And that's what circular reasoning is, right? You reason in a circle. You're assuming what is true, and then you just point back to it as the reason you believe it. So it's also called begging the question. In other words, assuming what you're trying to prove. So in Origin of the Species, Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. He went on to say, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. So this is a problem. In other words, we talked about the geologic scale with all the fossils in it, how you can either look at that as a time element and measure it that way, or you can change it and you can look at it as the result of the flood. But assuming that it is a time element for our discussion here, Darwin was saying, look, I expect in the future that we'll find all kinds of support for numerous small successive modifications, basically transitional forms, one thing changing into another as we work our way up the geologic column. However, that never happened. So Stephen Gould, who is used to be the paleontologist over at Harvard University, he's passed away at this point, but he said the fossil record does not support Darwinism. He said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. In other words, there is no real fossil evidence for evolution, so there's no sense looking there, was his point. And I think, he used to go back and forth with creationists, and I think he was getting beat up a lot because he had no evidence. So National Geographic came out with a presentation in 2004, and they said, illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor. Well, not much of a movie. In other words, the gaps are so tremendous and the information is not there to demonstrate transitional forms. Why would we believe it? So, what's the definition of spotty? What would the fossil record look like if creation were true, right? So this is the viewpoint of macroevolution. In other words, one thing changed to another. You see down the bottom of the tree, you go up and everything just branches off and changes from amoeba to man at the top. And that's the view of macroevolution. Now, microevolutionary changes within a type, yes, we see that. So you see on the left side, you have the tree with a dog at the bottom, and then you just have various dogs in the end posts of the tree. On the right, we have macroevolutionary changes between types, which is not evidenced in the fossil record, nor anywhere, actually. It's just an assumption that's trying to be proved. So this is the true picture, right? There aren't missing links. There's a missing chain. So it's not that the links in between the different species have not been found. There's no chain to bind them together. They're all created individually, and from an evolutionary standpoint, certainly, or if you use the geologic column as a time scale, they look at the Cambrian explosion as a time where you have all these fully made, complete fossilized remains that kind of explode at one point in time and reveal everything that's completed, which before it you have nothing leading up to it. So the fossil record can't establish ancestral relationships. That's the key. So 99% of the biology of any organism resides in its soft anatomy, which is inaccessible in a fossil. So what that means is that the only thing that ends up being fossilized is, for the most part, you're just dealing with bones. Sometimes you get a little more of an imprint, but you're not getting skin. You're not getting anything in soft tissue in that way. And even Henry Gee, chief science writer for Nature, said, to take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story, assuming perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. So that's key. So here are some questions that we could certainly ask an evolutionist. Remember, we go back to the Columbo tactic, if you remember that, right? So question one, somebody says, well, I believe in evolution. What do you mean by evolution? Do they mean microevolution, macroevolution? They may not even be sure what they even mean by evolution, because they haven't really thought it through. So let's say they mean macroevolution. Well, how did you come to that conclusion? What's your evidence? What leads you to conclude that one thing evolved from another over long periods of time when there's actually no evidence for it? And then you can say, have you ever considered that there's a common designer and not a common origin, that one thing evolved to another over time, but now you have a common designer as opposed to DNA and homology? Have you considered, regarding change within organisms and environmental factors? The best evidence to date indicates that these factors are inadequate to drive full-scale macroevolution. Something else is required, intelligence. Quote from William Dembski. Now, Stephen Gould and Niles Eldredge, they co-authored a paper called Punctuated Equilibrium in 1972, recognizing that there is no evidence of transitional forms in the fossil record. Therefore, they believe the lack of evidence means that species punctuated to the next level and left no trace. Conveniently, their evidence of evolution is not evidence. This is not science, but a story wrapped in technical language. I put this in here because here you have two scientists that realized, and were at least, though they're evolutionists and materialists, they realized that the fossil record did not represent what Darwin hoped it would eventually reveal. So instead of trying to just present that and pretend that it's science, they wrote a paper called Punctuated Equilibrium. Now follow on this, where they said that the evidence that one species punctuated to another was that it left nothing behind. Well, if that's the case, then what do you scientifically test to come to that conclusion? Again, this is not science. This is a story. This is a belief system that now you're adding some scientific language in a paper trying to describe the fact that, well, we believe that because there's nothing in the fossil record to show transitional forms, that it must have gone from one species to another, leaving no evidence behind. But if you have no evidence, then how is that scientific? Science is based on evidence. So I throw that in there because I think Gould did a lot of work for us to help us out there without actually realizing it. This is, again, the evidence for us that sometimes scientists make very bad philosophers. This is why David said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. The line has gone out to all the earth, and the words to the end of the world." So the earth is uniquely positioned for all the world to clearly see the heavens. This is not so with other planets. Other planets are blocked, so they can't see the whole universe, but God has uniquely positioned us. We talked about that before, where we have this privileged place within the universe, within our own solar system, galaxy, and then out into the universe where we can see the whole thing. It's just amazing. We have this ideal position, which is quite interesting. David again said, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth, for he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast." So God spoke, and the universe came into being from nothing. This is what all scientific and philosophical evidence makes clear. Now again, we accommodate the Big Bang model or whatever else that scientists would understand as revealing a beginning of the universe. Our goal at this point is not to teach creationism. Our goal is to establish that the universe had a beginning, and part of the evidence of that in this presentation obviously is design. Everything is designed. And then David also says, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him?" So it is clear that God made the universe and man in particular. He made the world habitable for man and located the earth in its unique position for man to be able to discover just what David did. And we've even seen beyond what David could discover at this point, obviously, with the advance in technology. Isaiah said, "I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad the earth by myself." God doesn't need any help, right? And astronomers have discovered the universe is expanding. Isaiah told us that a couple of thousand years, well, actually probably going back about 3,000 years ago now. So he wrote around 800 BC. So now we realize that science is always catching up with the Bible. That's why Paul said about the knowledge that everybody has of the heavens and creation. He says, what may be known of God is manifest in them. That's everybody. For God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. In other words, we can see God's attributes by his effects because we can't see him. Since we can't see God, we can at least see the effects. It's kind of like gravity. You can't see gravity, but you can certainly see the gravitational effects. And he goes on, Paul says, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. And he goes on to say, those who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, right, do so because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. So man was created with the ability to reason from what is available back to God. And God has made it manifest in everybody. Everybody has that capability. There's nobody walking around unless there's, obviously they have some kind of lacking capability that is not natural, and there's some damage. But other than that, everybody has the normal understanding that they can reason from what we see back to the existence of God. He says, for God has shown it to them, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, and God is known by his acts or effects, like we said. Being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power. So God is powerful enough to create the universe, and really which is kind of foundational to the cosmological argument, to make and sustain the universe, his power, and Godhead, talking about his divinity. God is intelligent, which again supports the design argument, so that they're without excuse. Everybody would be without excuse. So man has to deny his senses, reason, and logic to deny God's existence. In summary, that the universe was created by a creator is evident no matter what technology is available to man for observation and discovery. To think the universe made itself, or that there is no creator, is a folly of human willful ignorance. Look, David didn't have a telescope, and he knew that. That's why David said, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Imagine the folly of declaring there is no God when it can be easily discovered, observed and discovered otherwise. So that's our presentation. That wraps it up, just short of an hour. So I will move on next time to the moral argument. I pray that this encourages and blesses you. And so until we meet again kind of on the internet here, may God continue to richly bless you as you continue to study his word. Stay in the word and stay encouraged. Amen.